Hello and welcome to Cognitations, a podcast in which we interview cognitive scientists about their work and how it applies to our everyday lives. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of the mind. It encompasses domains such as cognitive psychology, the neurosciences, computer science, linguistics, philosophy, and more. Let's jump into today's episode. With today's hosts, I'm Jay.
And I'm Tanai.
Like many of our cognitive abilities, it's easy to take vision for granted. On a daily basis, vision seems rather simple. Various objects, people, landscapes present themselves before us. And, if our eyes are open and function well, we are bestowed with a visual experience of these things. We then act on this experience in all the ways the world affords us. In reality, things are much more complex than this naive experience might lead us to think. For instance, visual perception isn't passive in the way just described. Rather, our sense organs and brain are constantly performing an enormous amount of intricate operations. Importantly, most of these operations are not directly controllable in any significant way. So what is the nature of this impressive and somewhat autonomous machinery? Where does it start? What must our eyes do in order for us to perceive the world? How is what they do influenced by other psychological and biological factors? How is it even possible to study all of this? Today's guest is the person to answer, if not all these questions, at least some of them.
She is Thérèse Collins. She is a professor of cognitive psychology at Université de Paris Cité, where she is also the director of the vision team at the Integrative Neuroscience and Cognition Center. She obtained her PhD in psychology from Université Paris Descartes, post which she did a postdoc in Hamburg, Germany. Broadly, her research group studies visual perception, eye movements, and object representations. So thanks so much for accepting our invitation and being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Just to get us started, a standard question that we ask all of our guests is how they really came to be interested in cognitive science, and more particularly, in your case, in the topic of visual perception.
So I have to go back quite some time to answer that question. When I was a high school student, I was interested in philosophy because I wanted to ask the important questions in life, and so that's philosophy. And when I neared the end of my high school education, I got kind of frustrated with philosophy as being things that old white men did in books, and I wanted something a little bit less dusty. And so that kind of oriented me towards psychology, which at the time I felt was a kind of applied philosophy. Mm-hmm. I grew up in the States, and in the US, there's not much philosophy at all in high school. So the only philosophy I had was kind of finding out stuff by myself. So it was a very continental philosophy, and I wasn't at all exposed to other kinds of philosophy. So that oriented me towards psychology. And I started my university studies in the US, and then I came to France to study psychology. And I was interested in psycholinguistics because as a multicultural, bilingual person, I was interested in what happens in people's brains when they can speak several languages, like myself and my family. I did an internship on psycholinguistics, and I just found it so complicated. Language is so hard. I mean, there's morphology, there's syntax, there's semantics.
Well, this is the place to plug our previous episode
Okay.
that just came out. We just had Alex Christia and Camilla Scaff who said the exact same thing, that it's really complex.
It's complex, and they have the merit of having pursued, and I just gave up. I said, this is too hard for me. I want to do something more simple, and so rather than showing words and sentences to people on a screen, I decided to show them dots. And that's how I got into vision.
Oh,
it's just so much easier.
And Alex and Camilla also said that they think that there's a divide in psychology between people who hate language and people who love language. Do you think you're reluctant to study it just because it's too complex, or do you think that there's something more there, like that it's maybe too hard to get a grasp on generally?
That's a good question. I don't know. I'm very envious of people who study language. And for a long time, I just felt, again, that it was so complex and it would be hard to get a grasp on the real fundamental mechanisms. And I think that's what really interests me, actually, in psychology, is to really be able to understand very basic mechanisms. And I think, of course, some people are there in language studies, but it's more difficult. And so I found, I guess, a kind of more intellectual pleasure on the simplicity of vision relative to the complexity of language. But I definitely admire psycholinguists.
And just to go back to the initial attraction you had to philosophy, do you still see psychology as a kind of applied philosophy? And do you think it answers some of the questions you may have started off with?
Well, there's something that I often tell my students in an introductory psychology class, which is that philosophers ask the important questions and psychologists ask the questions that can be answered. So I think it's a back and forth between philosophy and psychology. And one thing that I am kind of disappointed by and that I regret, I think this is probably especially true in France, but also everywhere, is that there's not enough crosstalk. I think that psychologists have a lot to learn from philosophers. And I think that most cognitive psychologists don't really understand what the input of philosophy could be. And that's a big shame, because I think that psychology, cognitive psychology in general, would benefit from the input of philosophers, especially analytic philosophers, which is why I'm such a big fan of cognitive science, which is where all of these different people and approaches can meet. And I wish that there was more of that.
Could you maybe give a more concrete example of where an input of philosophy might help psychology, as you mentioned?
Philosophers in general are good at defining their terms. So they think really hard and carefully about what this means, what's the level of explanation, can you compare a psychological construct like motivation with something like emotion. So it's really thinking about if you could have like a taxonomy of different terms. And I think that when you want to study what the mechanisms are behind these psychological constructs, like vision, like perception, like motivation, like a particular emotion, the very first step is to correctly define what you're interested in studying.
Right.
And psychologists are sometimes more concentrated on the experimental side, the operationalized side, like how would you measure motivation without thinking about what does motivation mean? And you can plug anything you want for motivation, perception, memory. And I would like psychologists to take more time to define their constructs.
Right.
And our friends, the philosophers, would really be helpful.
Well, let's do a bit of that now.
Okay.
So you mentioned in the list of things that might be distinguished, perception and vision. And so to introduce the topics we're discussing today and get a bit of terminological clarity, what's the difference between vision and perception?
I would say that vision is a much larger term than perception. So a physicist who studies optics and optics of the eye is doing vision. A psychologist is also doing vision, but we're more interested in perception, which is our experience of the world. So when you talk about perception or visual perception, it's a very specific reference to the internal representation of the world that causes our experience of the world, our feelings about the world, and our behavior in the world.
So there's vision without perception.
Absolutely, yeah.
And on the other hand, you can also have perception without vision, I presume.
Well, yeah, perception is a general term. And I guess if you're interested in visual perception, you can be completely ignorant, as is my case, about the optics of the eye. These are two different things. And of course, someone who studies the optics of the eye is explaining a lot of things about vision, but might have not the faintest idea of how to measure visual perception or how to quantify behavior. That's fine. Scientists do different things.
And so it seems like when we're talking about visual perception, just from our daily experiences, that a reliance on this particular sense is quite strong. Would you know why that is?
It's difficult to answer that question. I mean, I guess, of course, there are other animals that rely on vision the way that we do. There are animals that rely on vision with visual systems that are vastly different from ours. And of course, there are animals who rely on different senses as their primary way to interact with the world. The question of why are life forms different? I think Charles Darwin provided a pretty convincing explanation for that, and I have nothing further to add.
I was wondering, for the listeners as well, could we also walk through the biological substrate or the machinery for vision, which would be the eye? So let's say if you had to introduce how the eye works to an alien in 2 minutes, how would you do that?
I wouldn't do it very well because, as I said, I'm not a physicist. I cannot explain visual optics. So intuitively, of course, and I think that this is probably sufficient for psychologists to understand the eye. It's basically just a way to concentrate visual input, so light, into the back of the eye, in which there are photosensitive receptors that transform the light information into neural information, into electric information. And then that moves up the neural pathway from the eye. There are a couple of steps, but it ends up in primary visual cortex, which counterintuitively is in the back of the brain. And then from there is where visual perception kind of starts in a very global sense.
And more generally, how much vision science or like perceptual psychology, more precisely, really depends on this lower level stuff that biologists and physicists?
That's an excellent question. And this is another domain in which I think psychologists would benefit from talking more with their colleagues, and again, an argument in favor of cognitive science. I absolutely think that the physical and physiological characteristics of the visual system impose constraints on the way that we represent information, on the way that we acquire information in the world, and therefore on the way that we perceive the world. So, of course, visual perception is not divorced from the instruments that we have to apprehend the world. And oftentimes, visual perception is studied independently of those. And that's probably not such a great thing.
And psychologists could benefit from input from biologists and physicists. But do you think that there's also the inverse relation, where some people studying how the eye works might benefit in some cases from knowing things about the psychology of vision?
Yes, because psychologists are the only ones who are really interested in function. So I guess everyone who studies the eye and who studies vision is interested in what is this thing good for? And psychologists are the ones who say, well, what is the resultant, what is the output of this system, basically, and to what extent is the structure of the system important for that particular output? So there might be some physiological, even genetic differences that influence, this protein in the eye or that protein in the eye that influences the way that the retina grows during development. That's fantastic. But the question that I always ask is, what are the functional consequences? Are there functional consequences? And if there aren't, maybe this is less interesting to study than a different set of physiological differences or proteins, genetic differences that do have functional consequences.
Could you give us a concrete example of a functional consequence of a physiological constraint?
Well, so for example, there are some scientists some neuroscientists who study the physiology of the retina. So this isn't my area of expertise, so I'm just going to be very general. And who can study, for example, the presence or absence of a particular growth factor during development. During normal development, that factor is present and the eye develops in a certain way. And if it's not present because of genetic mutations or whatever, the eye develops in a different way. And so you can create knockout mice who don't express this particular growth factor or who don't express this particular protein. And then you can harvest their eyes and look at the retina and show that there are cellular differences between the two. Okay, a physiologist or a cellular neuroscientists is going to be, hooray, this is the end of the story.
Right.
Because they found the way in which this particular factor influences the cell types. And my question is always, so what? What are the consequences for perceiving? What are the consequences for vision of having, of expressing or not this particular growth factor or this particular protein? In a way, it's kind of also because psychologists always get asked, well, where does this happen in the brain? If you show that there's an effect of a particular context or condition on perception, in one condition you perceive one thing, in another condition you perceive another thing, people will always ask, so where does it happen in the brain? So I always ask biologists, so what are the functional consequences? Just to kind of get even.
So to start actually talking about that, so we've discussed kind of these very low-level things, biological things, and then also how the eye works. Then you talked about information going to the primary visual cortex. So I guess we can ask what kind of information is in the primary visual cortex, and then what happens to it after it's processed there.
That is the entire goal of vision science.
Is there like a kind of broad strokes picture one could give, do you think?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that neuroscientists don't even agree on what the neural code is. I think that most neuroscientists would agree that we don't know what the neural code is.
And what is the neural code?
So how information is represented in the activity of neurons.
Okay.
So some people say that it's the firing rate. So the more a neuron fires, the more it's going to contribute to the function, so to seeing something. Other people will say, no, the neural code is contained in like the temporal relationship between different neurons. And so this is getting into the domain of computational neuroscience. But I mean, more generally speaking, even if we don't know the neural code, there's an idea that there's a hierarchy of processes. So very low-level visual information is processed in the primary visual cortex, things like contrast, size. And then as you move up in the hierarchy of visual areas, then you get into kind of mid-level vision, like shape, color, motion direction, things like that. And even further along in the temporal cortex, you have more complex shapes like objects, and identifiable objects like a person or a house. And even further along, individual samples like your grandmother or you know, your friend or your personal house.
But how since you mentioned that people are still figuring out the neural code for visual information, how did scientists figure out that there was even a hierarchy in the first place?
A couple of different ways. So the classic, probably historically earliest way is neuropsychology. So you find patients who have specific brain lesions and you see what their deficits are. And deficits in different areas of the brain will give, lesions in different parts of the brain will give you different deficits. And so you can say, okay, that part of the brain is specifically involved in shape if the person has difficulty recognizing shapes, like has agnosia or something. Whereas lesions in earlier stages of the visual cortex will lead to much more fundamental, even sometimes blindness.
So you talked about where vision starts, but where does vision end? So you talked about neurons in the temporal cortex that encode more complex shapes of people and stuff. Is that still perception, or does it contribute to perception and then other kinds of cognition? Or is there a way to kind of say where perception stops and cognition starts?
That's a great question. So a lot of neuroscientists will stop there. So they'll say, we've identified cells that are specific to a given object, and these cells therefore subserve perception. This is probably true, but cells don't perceive, people perceive. So I think that there's a really important, very complicated step going from the activity of neurons to perception. And I think that in that step, psychology is absolutely fundamental. The only way that we can make the link between neuronal activity, even neural activity, and perception is to measure perception. And the only way to do that is psychology.
So since we're speaking about measurement, you worked on eye movements called saccades? Saccades? What's the correct?
It depends if you're American or British.
Oh, so
That's why I can never figure it out.
and I think you're both in a way, or you've
Yes.
grown up in.
I'm British and French by nationality, but I grew up in the US and Canada.
So how do you pronounce?
I say saccade.
Okay. So what are they, and what is their role?
Saccades are very rapid eye movements that bring the center of gaze from one location in space to another location in space. And they are absolutely necessary to vision because our retina, so the part of the eye which is sensitive to light, is inhomogeneous. So there are more cells, and the way that the cells are connected makes that the center of our retina has a much higher acuity than the periphery.
What is acuity?
Acuity is the sensitivity of vision.
Okay.
So if you look directly at something, the object which is placed in the middle of your gaze benefits from a lot of processing power.
Okay.
There are a lot of cells that contribute to that perception. And an object that's in the periphery of your vision is going to have less processing power. So if we actually want to see anything with any detail, we have to look at it. And a classic example is that contrary to what we experience, we don't actually have any color sensitivity in the periphery. Of course, if you ask someone, do you have color sensitivity in your periphery? What are they going to do? They're going to look in the periphery and they're going to say, yeah. But of course, that's no longer their periphery. So it's really difficult to have an intuitive feeling about this, but that's what the physiology says. And so basically, to have any kind of detailed or color vision even, you have to move your eyes around a scene. And the way we move our eyes is by saccades. They're really fast. The goal is to minimize the time that your eyeball is moving because there's no vision during that movement, and to maximize the times that the eyeball is fixed such that we are able to see.
So there are moments of temporary blindness.
Absolutely.
Technically, but you don't feel it.
Yes, and another example of blindness is when you blink, which we do several times per second.
Right.
Gigantic interruption of visual input,
Right.
but we don't experience that.
And do our blinks of the eyes coordinate with the temporary interruption that you just mentioned, or not necessarily so?
Yes, oftentimes saccades and blinks are coordinated. And that's an argument in favor of the idea that indeed the system is trying to minimize the no vision time. Because when you blink and when you move your eyes, there's basically no functional input.
Oh, that's quite cool.
Yeah, it's really impressive how the same. So there's parts of the eye that have very low acuity. There are many moments all the time where we have this temporary blindness. It's pretty crazy how we can see anything at all, given.
Well, yeah,
all of
I
that.
completely agree, and that's actually my that's what I do research on. I find that's a fundamental question about like what makes us human is that we have this very strong dependence on vision. Visual perception is really important to everything, to our everyday life. And how do we get there? How do we have this very rich, very stable, a very meaningful visual experience when actually what comes into the visual system, the input, is highly variable? I find that fascinating, and I think that that's really a perfect example of cognitive science because you need to go from physiology, from the input, from the computations that are made in the eye and in the brain to experience.
Listeners might be wondering if saccades are possibly controllable, or we can be aware of them. So are saccades just purely subpersonal automatic, or is there some way we can control them or some awareness we can have of them?
Both. So there are some times where we make reflexive saccades, involuntary saccades. Of course, when there's a particular pathology, then people can lose the control of their eyes. But outside of pathology, of course, our eyes can be attracted towards things in the environment, kind of like our attention, right? If you see something really flashy in the periphery, your eyes are going to tend to go towards that, and you cannot suppress that. But of course, on the other hand, we also are voluntary beings. We can decide, I'm not going to look there. Or we can decide, there's nothing flashy over there. I'm nevertheless going to go and take a look. So we're not complete slaves to our environment, but we're not completely detached from it either.
And you've also, you've worked on a property that saccades can have, which is plasticity. What is saccadic plasticity, and what can it tell us about vision?
So, saccadic plasticity is the short-term change of the way you look at something. So usually if something flashy occurs in the environment, you'll make an eye movement towards it. And that eye movement will tend to be appropriate to the object's position. So in the end, your center of gaze will be on that object. That's the point. You want to see it. If you repeatedly experience that your eye movement is insufficient because of tiredness, because of pathology or something, that your eye systematically doesn't go far enough, then you will learn after a while to change basically the input to your muscles, to give a bigger input, to be able to reestablish appropriate gaze behavior. And so you can basically change the relationship between where something is perceived to be in the periphery and the motor coordinates or the motor plan that the brain needs to instantiate to acquire that object. So this is a kind of very simple example of motor learning. You can have motor learning with arm movements, with all kinds of movements, and this is just in the eye. And what interested me in saccadic plasticity, this is my PhD work, is to understand if and how changing the motor coordinates had an influence on what people perceived.
Can you unpack this idea of changing motor coordinates?
Right. So if you learn, for example, if you're fatigued and you learn that you need to put more, let's say, effort into your motor command. So you need to make a bigger motor command to finally get to the same location in space. That's relatively easy to do in the laboratory. You can teach people, you can trick people into thinking that they made an incorrect eye movement. And they will change their eye movement progressively over a couple of minutes, such that basically what their brain is doing is changing the motor input, but to get the same behavior, to correct for this experimental trick that we're doing.
Right.
And so by doing that, we've dissociated the motor coordinates or the motor plan from the visual location. And so then what you can do is ask people simply to undergo this kind of plasticity or adaptation and then report where they perceive things to be in space. And what you can observe is that when people change their motor plan, for example, if they have to put more effort into their motor plan, if they have to make it bigger in a way, then they will report that things seem to be farther away. And inversely, if they have to reduce their motor plan to maintain their gaze on location, then they'll report that things appear to be closer. As if there's a contribution of where we feel that things are in space, of how much effort it takes to go and see them.
And does this difference in reports persist, or does it tend to disappear with time?
So in the laboratory, it disappears with time because when people leave the laboratory, they're no longer subject to this experimental trick. So they observe that their eye movements are correct, and so everything kind of goes back to normal. In patients who have a kind of permanent deficit, in theory, although this has never been tested, there would be a continual also shift of perceived space. But again, this remains to be tested.
So does this mean that people who exert, let's say, more motor effort also feel more fatigued after, let's say, locating an object in the visual field?
I don't know.
Because I'm just thinking, as a person who has corrected vision, from when you said this, I thought of how much motor effort I have to put in sometimes to locate certain objects. which...
So I think that if you weren't wearing your glasses, then you'd have to make more of an effort.
Right.
And that would fatigue you. But the point of glasses is...
to not let that happen.
Exactly. To make your vision correct without fatigue.
Right.
Maybe I didn't choose the term effort properly. It's not that there's more effort to be made. It's just that you have to... The input to the motor system has to change.
And how would that be different from effort, if you could just clarify? Because I don't think I completely
So, for example,
follow.
if you imagine that acquiring a particular object in space, so moving your eyes towards a particular location in space, requires a certain population of neurons to discharge at a certain rate. And if you want your eye to go further, they have to discharge at a higher rate.
Okay.
Yeah. Here we have the distinction between people doing things and cells doing things.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So this doesn't necessarily correlate with the amount of effort you put in, necessarily.
Not in the sense of effort that then leads to fatigue. Yeah.
Gotcha. Thanks for clarifying that. So since underlying theme of our conversation so far has also been to focus on the functional significance, what is it about saccades that really illuminates, let's say, the functioning of other psychological processes, vision or otherwise?
I guess this might be an example of what we were talking about before. So the way that the eye is made, the way that the extraocular muscles are connected to the eyeball, is a constraint that physiology imposes on perception and on visual perception. So I think that the way that we see is highly dependent on how we move our eyes around the world. And so any coherent explanation of what vision is has to take saccades into account, has to take eye movements into account. There are other eye movements than saccades, but so eye movements in general need to be part of the explanation of what it means to see.
Right. But what about, let's say, some common, let's say, folk psychological constructs like attention? Do saccades, what is it about saccades that, let's say, provides a new insight about the nature of attention? Or maybe, you could even define attention.
That's a great question. So saccades orient attention, right? When you look at something, you pay attention to it. Of course, you can also orient attention without looking at it. That's covert attention. And so it's been shown that the brain areas involved in orienting saccades, so overt attention, overlap, but not entirely, with the brain areas involved in covert attention.
Okay.
And that can give you some ideas about what these different processes have in common, what these different constructs have in common.
Right.
And the other thing relative to your question is that it's possible to fixate somewhere and pay attention somewhere else, but it's not possible to move your eyes somewhere without also moving your attention there. So in some ways, this might mean that attention is a way to make a hierarchy in visual information. You can't process everything, so we decide what we can process. That's one of the definitions of attention. And that psychological construct is basically the slave of our eyes. You cannot pay attention to somewhere else than where you're moving your eyes to. So again, if you want to understand attention, what attention is, how it arises in the brain, how it contributes to our visual experience, you cannot ignore eye movements.
And yet things seem more complex than that, no? Because this is about visual attention. But at the same time, a student might be looking at the blackboard and you speaking, but actually paying more attention to what their classmate is saying next to them.
Yes. So they're fixating somewhere, paying attention to somewhere else. Yes. However, if they look over at their classmate, around the time that they're making that eye movement, they cannot but pay attention to their classmate.
Okay, it's that, yeah.
So is what Jay just mentioned an example of covert attention?
Exactly, yes.
Okay. And so I'm thinking of, just to sort of wrap my head around covert attention, when you're imagining something, is that an example of covert attention in play? Maybe I'm in your class daydreaming about something. from the figments of my imagination. I didn't do that in your class, but I've really paid a lot of attention.
Good, I'm happy.
But hypothetically speaking, if this were the case, is this an example of covert attention?
I don't think that's the term that psychologists would use to describe what happens to processing when you're mind wandering or daydreaming.
Okay.
Covert attention is usually reserved for how our processing capabilities are distributed throughout the visual field. And there's a location in the visual field that has better processing, and that's where attention is.
I see.
Daydreaming or mind wandering can maybe take you away from the entire visual field, but it won't necessarily be spatially localized.
And what, sorry, I don't quite follow. What do you mean by spatially localized?
So covert attention is like when you're fixating at a particular location, if you're looking at the blackboard or at the teacher, but you're paying attention to the student who's on your left.
Okay.
You're covertly paying attention to the left. So there's a kind of spatial connotation here.
I see.
You can also, across the board, across the visual field, just have overall less attention because you're more focused on your internal thoughts because you're mind wandering. So there's no spatial connotation there.
I see. I guess why I was confused is that in folk psychological terms, we often say, oh, you're seeing your thoughts, or you're seeing your dreams. And therefore, to me, it seemed very intuitive that, oh, you are sort of paying covert attention to something that's spatially, let's say, located in an internal representation rather than something that's out there.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yes, because you can also, of course, ask people to introspect about their representation. So you can ask them, visualize your living room and now pay attention to the left side of the couch. And you can try and see if people are able to orient their attention on an internal representation.
Okay.
And does this overlap with motor commands and things like that? Because it has been shown that when we imagine actions, for example, they're the same motor commands that are sent, but they're just not executed in many cases. Is this also the case for eye movements?
Yes, to a certain extent. So I think this ties back to what I was saying before, that there are some brain areas that are shared between overt and covert attention. So there's something in common about orienting towards a location in space. And then at one point, maybe at the end, if you decide to orient to that location in space with your eyes, then you have one final way to get there. And if you decide to orient only with your kind of internal spotlight, then there's another way to get there. But they probably share quite a big part of the initial stages of processing.
And does this include then some motor commands without the actual movement being executed?
Most people would argue yes.
Okay.
So I don't think that has quite reached the level of scientific consensus to be, very sure about that. But I don't think that any psychologist would deny that motor processes are involved in orienting. But to what extent and to what level, that remains kind of an object of debate.
Okay, cool. And so we talk about saccades, but what are some other kinds of eye movements and mechanisms that are important for vision?
So one thing that I can talk about is what I'm currently interested in and doing research on, which is the idea that what we perceive at a particular point in time is, of course, the result of the stimulus, but it's also dependent on what we experienced and what we saw just before. This is actually the same kind of question as with eye movements, because what I was interested in with eye movements is to understand, so we have these periods of not seeing because of eye movements. Nevertheless, our experience of the world is stable. So input variability versus output stability, basically, because of eye movements. But there's a whole bunch of other kinds of variability that can occur between the input and the output. The output is stable. The lights can change in a room. The sun can go behind a cloud. This completely changes the input, but we don't experience objects to change either color or shape when we have these changes. And there's also fluctuations in the neural representation of the same object. So slight changes in the way that neurons respond, that populations of neurons respond, but we don't experience changes. So again, the general question is, how do we get from the variability in the input to a constant and stable psychological experience of the world, independently of eye movements? And so in the lab, I study that by asking people to report what they see and seeing to what extent their reports depend, of course, on the stimulus, but also on the statistics of past stimuli. The idea being that there might be some kind of very short-term temporal integration that causes our perception and so smooths over these spurious fluctuations.
And how do you...
To kind of just take a little step back quickly, maybe slow down. So you talked about variability of the input and stability constancy of the output, what's usually called perceptual constancies, I guess. Can you walk us through an example of a perceptual constancy, just so the listeners can have like a real good idea of what one could be? So for example, maybe color or...
Yeah, color constancy is one of the classic examples. So if you were to put a Rubik's Cube under a blue light, you would see the red cubes as the red parts of the Rubik's Cube as red. And then you put that same cube under a yellow light. And of course, the wavelengths that reach your eye from that same red part of the Rubik's Cube are going to be completely different. We do not, however, perceive that the parts of the Rubik's Cube change colors just because you change the light. So that's color constancy. So there's what the visual system is doing is taking into account the relationships between the colors or the wavelengths of the different parts. And because those stay constant, then our experience stays constant. So there you have the input, which is really varying, different wavelengths, but the output is perceptually constant.
And so the question that you're interested in, if I understand, is how much does that depend on statistical information about past perceived?
Yes. Yes.
And how just circling back to the question I wanted to ask, which was, how do you get at measuring the statistics of past stimuli that people have experienced?
So we ask them to do very boring psychophysical experiments where we control the entirety of their input. So if you ask people to report the orientation of a line on the screen, that's all they see. Of course, they can do that. It's a stupid task that psychologists love. People's responses are perfectly correlated to the stimulus, obviously. But what you can see is that their responses are not perfect. There's a little bit of variability. So if you ask someone to report what they see when you show them a vertical bar, most of the time they're going to respond vertical, but sometimes it'll be tiny bit shifted to the left, tiny bit shifted to the right, just because there's some noise in what people respond. And then you can observe that that noise is not completely random, but it tends to be tilted in the direction of the past. So if you show them an orientation that's slightly counterclockwise from vertical, and then you show them something vertical, they're going to tend to make small errors in the direction of counterclockwise. And that suggests that their current perceptual experience is due, of course, to the vertical stimulus, but is also integrating in a weighted fashion the previous stimulus. And so now you can take that and you can replace previous stimulus by 2 previous, or 6 previous, or an average of 1, an average of 100, and 3 seconds in the past, 6 seconds in the past. So you can define the statistics and the context of what's happening now in different ways.
Right.
And see to what extent do those statistics influence what you're seeing now.
Right. Super interesting. So thinking, because I'm always looking for more concrete examples that sort of resonate with our listeners. So, I mean, it seems patently obvious that all of us, because we have grown up in different environments, have, let's say, different statistical contingencies of the visual inputs that we receive. Is there a good example that everyone can intuitively relate to where you could say that, hey, look, like people who grew up here might see this thing very differently as opposed to people who grew up someplace else, if this idea is true?
That's a great question. I cannot answer it, and I don't know that there's any data out there about cultural differences in these kinds of low-level processes. I mean, of course, one of the basic tenets of cognitive psychology, which used to be called general psychology, is that what we're investigating here are general psychological mechanisms that are sufficiently low-level such as to not be influenced by cultural differences. Of course, lots of vision, higher level vision, can be influenced by cultural differences. And the question remains open as to whether this kind of temporal integration in perception is subject or not to cultural differences.
Fair enough.
Well, and what kind of statistical influence are we talking about when it comes to ecological contexts? Because then it seems like the kinds of statistical regularities you're looking at in the lab are things that you can only get in the lab, right?
Yes. So the idea, of course, in the lab, when we measure these errors that are towards the past, people are making mistakes. But we think that this is a process that is smoothing over variations that in normal life should not lead to perceived differences. Of course, in other contexts, depending on the task, depending on the environment, it may be more beneficial to the visual system to accentuate differences, so to increase discriminability. And so there are other experiments that you can do where you show in different contexts that people actually tend to be repulsed from what they see in the past. So if in the past you saw a particular thing, you will tend to see something different now. The idea being that the system can also exaggerate variability in the environment to allow you to perceive and to distinguish different objects. And that's one of the really, to me, burning questions in this kind of visual perception. What conditions make repulsion? What conditions make attraction? When do you want to accentuate being able to dissociate? And when do you want to smooth away variations? All in the favor of perceiving things properly.
So do you think that an important thing to keep in mind, because when we hear about dependence on statistical facts about stimuli, one could think, oh yeah, well, this is a process by which we adapt to our environments in certain ways and we change our vision to suit the environment. And so what happens is what we're seeing itself can change. But is it right to say that that's not the way to interpret it at all? And actually, it's adapting to the environment in order to get the same quality or the same kind of vision as you would across conditions or across stimuli or something like that?
I'm not sure. So I guess that it could be argued, again, as a function of the context. It kind of depends what you want, what the visual system wants to maximize. So your experience of the visual world, perhaps culturally, again, we don't really know, but your experience of the visual world gives you some kind of internal representation of how things are normal. And depending on the context, you could either want to interpret differences with the normal as actually that's not different. That's just, spurious fluctuation and everything is stable. Or in a different task or in a different context, you might want to say, okay, this is a tiny bit different from normal. So let me exaggerate that to go check out what's going on. And again, I mean, I'm aware that this is very vague. But I think it's also because we don't have a good handle right now on what makes you go from discrimination to smoothing out fluctuations.
Okay. So we've been talking a lot about behaviors like saccades. But let's move on to the devices that we use to measure it, which would namely be eye tracking. Could you briefly tell us more about this technology and how widespread its use is in psychology?
Sure. Yeah, for a long time it was not very widespread because it required big, clunky, and expensive machines. Over the past, I'd say 20, 30 years, it's become much more accessible. There are companies now that make out-of-the-box eye trackers.
Oh, wow.
And most of these eye trackers depend on just a little video of the eye, and then computer vision algorithms that allow you to identify the different parts of the eye, so the pupil, and that can use that as a signal to identify in which direction the eye is looking.
Right.
If you film the eye, there's the size of the pupil will change on screen, not in the eye, but on the screen. It will change depending on whether the eye is looking straight at the camera or a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. And so there's a lawful relationship between the way that the pupil in the image changes and where the person is looking. And so that makes it very easy to determine where someone's looking on a screen.
Right, right. And do you think that this technological advance has sort of opened participation in vision science to a broader mass of scientists?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Any good vision science laboratory now in the world will have an eye tracker.
I see. Moving on, these movements that we have been talking about, namely oculomotor behavior, I think this also comes back to a question that we asked earlier, which is that how could these behaviors sort of give us insights about other processes apart from vision or attention that aren't solely, let's say, visual in its modality? First of all, is it even possible to sort of make that inferential jump from, let's say, oculomotor behavior to other psychological processes?
I guess another way to put it is it beneficial for people who don't work on vision to use eye tracking to study their construct?
That's a beautifully framed question.
Yes. And of course, there are a lot of people who do use eye tracking not to investigate vision. For example, you can use eye tracking to study reading. This is a really big field. So you look at how and where the eyes move when people are reading a sentence, and based on differences in the size of the saccades, in how long people stop on each word or on each part of the word. And if you relate those oculomotor differences to linguistic differences or linguistic characteristics of the word or the sentence, then you can make hypotheses about how people are processing that information.
Oh, wow.
You can also use eye movements just as a kind of reaction time measure. So how long do babies look at one object or another object? It's not really about vision, it's about their categorization or, their perception. So eye movements are definitely a method that can be used to investigate all kinds of psychological constructs.
Could you quickly just define what reaction time is?
Reaction time is how long it takes someone to respond or react to an instruction or a stimulus.
Gotcha.
And I guess our people who haven't been exposed to too much psychology won't realize how centrally important reaction time is.
Absolutely.
And we talk about it like willy-nilly because we know that it's important.
Yes.
But,
Yeah, one of the basic tenets of cognitive psychology is that psychological processes take time, and therefore you can use reaction time as a handle onto those processes. And that's why, as you say, it's so ubiquitous. It used to be pressing on a button, and now eye movements have given a new reaction time measure, which is centrally related to the goal of psychology.
And what's the advantage of using eye tracking, which is a bit more expensive than button pressing, rather than button pressing to take psychological measures?
You don't have to instruct people to look somewhere. So you can also just observe where they move their eyes in the absence of an instruction, and that can give you a handle on the processes that are underlying whatever it is that they're doing. Looking for something, deciding on something, reading words, whereas, of course, button presses need to be instructed. That's also why eye movements are so used in babies. You cannot, of course, instruct a baby to press on a button when they perceive green or blue. But you can look at their eye movements and see if their eye movements show a differential reaction to green versus blue, and therefore conclude from that they do perceive the difference.
Yeah, babe would probably just press on all the buttons. Just
Yeah.
however. So one of the things that might be illuminated by using eye tracking is serial order effects in perception, which is something you've worked on. So what are these? And are there some striking examples of such effects?
So these serial order effects is what I was talking about before. So the fact that you are influenced by the statistics or by the order or the series of things that happened before. So such that your current perception is not independent of the recent past and possibly even the distant past, because the distant past is like making up some kind of internal representation, prior, as Bayesians like to call it. Eye movements and serial effects are not directly related, except in the fact that they're both related to this overall question of going from input variability because of eye movements or because of other fluctuations in the input to stability in our perception.
Would you say that we represent serial order when it has an effect on our perception? Or do you think the effect it has is kind of outside what we represent?
No, I don't think that we represent order when it has an effect on our current perception. We can have an internal representation of order. We can remember the order things happened in. We can observe that one order is different from another order. But this is a different question.
Is there something to say about that question? Can a representation of some series of things have an effect on perceptual processes?
Yeah, so this is not something that I know particularly well, but there are some colleagues working on auditory perception who, if I remember correctly, have shown that people are actually sensitive to very small changes in very complex sequences, auditory sequences. Perhaps this has been done in vision, I'm not quite sure. But the fact that we're sensitive to these very small differences in complex sequences suggests that we do have some kind of high-level representation of order. And this effect was rather surprising when it was discovered because it wasn't thought that we were able to have such a complex representation of order.
So I would say this is the time to now switch gears a bit and sort of get into the domain of things more applied. So we've been talking a lot about, how vision works, the underlying machinery, the functional significance. And it seems like it's a very amazing thing that seems to be working for us pretty well. Why haven't we been able to program machines to see equally well?
I don't know.
That's fine.
I don't know. I mean, to program a machine, this is like way out of my area of expertise.
But if you just had to take a stab, it just seems like from what you have been telling us, it just seems like there's such a good understanding of how human vision works. And for other...
I'm pleased that you feel that way, but actually it's not really true. I mean, I think that there are so many unknowns and questions in vision, which is kind of surprising because it's one of the most studied, if not the most studied.
So what
perception.
Would those unknowns be, for instance?
Again, what's the neural code? What exactly are the mechanisms that allow us to have this experience of the visual world given the input that we have? So these very fundamental questions are areas of debate.
I guess another way of getting at the question could be start with the observation that human vision requires a bunch of things that depend on our physiology, on our anatomy, and we have so these constancies, and eye movements that allow very efficient information processing. And yet computer vision doesn't use these. And so does that difference between human vision that depends on anatomy and physiology, and is there a difference between this and the computer vision that's important? And should we maybe design computers that work on some of the same principles as human vision? Or is it efficient to depart from that and maybe find like new principles for computer vision?
That's a great question. I mean, I think one of the reasons that we have an inhomogeneous retina and that we have eye movements is that if we were to have the same acuity, the same processing power across the entire visual field, we would need a brain many times bigger than what we have. So it's a way basically of optimizing the processing capacity that we have to a small part of the visual scene just because we can't have gigantic heads. Computers don't have this constraint. So it may be possible to make a computer that has enough processing power such that you don't need to have all of these constraints. Because it's, I mean, you can, make a bigger box or optimize, the innards of a computer to have better processing.
Right. But yet it seems like, despite ignoring these constraints, like computer vision seems to, at least up to my knowledge and what we gleaned from our talk with Nancy Canvasher previously, they seem to be failing at very basic processes like object recognition.
Absolutely.
Which we seem to do all the time.
Well, we've all seen these relatively recent examples on social media where you have these artificial intelligence algorithms that allow you to identify objects in a scene. And so there are some examples where you show an image, and it's amazing that these algorithms, these new algorithms, are able to do it. Wow. But then, of course, there are many examples where you show an image that doesn't necessarily seem to be more complex.
Right.
And it completely fails. We all use, when we're on the internet, we all use these CAPTCHA things to prove that we're human. Well, there you go, because only humans can do that.
Right.
So that's definitely, I mean, I agree that that's one of the final frontiers, I guess.
So it's not advisable to merge with computers just yet, I guess.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And so there have also been some applied eye tracking studies in domains such as marketing. Can you say a few words about applications of eye tracking studies and vision science? And maybe say some words, if you want to, about how reliable applying scientific findings in this domain to other domains
Sure.
is.
I mean, I guess like any device that can be used to measure people's behavior, you can use that to study marketing behavior. Eye movements are attractive in that particular area, I think, because visual objects are so important in marketing. There's good applied science and there's bad applied science. Just like not applied science, there's good and bad science everywhere. I think that unfortunately the ease with which now it's possible to buy and use an eye tracker is sometimes at the detriment of good applied science. So let me give you a more concrete example. If you want to see how someone is orienting their gaze on a web page, to see if they're looking at this ad or this content or that content, then of course you need to have an eye tracker that is appropriate to what you're looking at. And many webcam eye trackers don't really have a resolution that allows you to differentiate more than like quadrants of your screen. So if you have a small content close to another small content and you say, well, we're able to differentiate where subjects are looking, well, simply technically speaking, you don't have that power with the eye tracker. And unfortunately, there's sometimes, people get excited about, using an eye tracker, a webcam eye tracker, which makes it easy. But I think that there needs to be more thought given to the correspondence between the technical specificities of the eye tracker and the question that you're trying to ask.
And so maybe, because I'm not completely clear on the underlying objective of these studies, is the idea that if you orient your gaze, let's say, on one portion of the web page where a product is being advertised, is the idea that, gaze sort of predicts consumer behavior later down the line?
I think that's what some of these studies would like to do.
Okay.
That they'd be able to say, if you place your ad here, then you'll get more gazes, more looks.
Gotcha.
And then you're more likely to have encoding in memory or more clicks on the ad or something like that. And I think that this, I'm so personally not interested in these kinds of questions that it's difficult to be fair. But I think that applied science needs to be very careful.
So you don't think the applied science is there yet in this domain?
No, because again, I think that there are so many out-of-the-box eye trackers, like webcam eye trackers, that people are kind of using and being excited about, but they're not necessarily appropriate to the questions that they're asking.
Which is good. We don't want them to be better at selling us stuff, maybe. I don't know. Maybe you do.
No, I agree with you. And that's why I think, I'm being kind of unfair with with applied research and marketing, because the goal is not something that I feel particularly in line with.
Right. Another aspect of our contemporary environments is that we live a very screen-saturated digital life, and there seems to be some intense public concern about kids or even adults like us spending time on screens. Given that we have been talking about vision and the cognitive processes that underlie it, do you think that there's something about the screen saturation that is altering these processes that we talked about?
No, I don't think that screens per se are changing much about modern life. I think that screens are changing the amount of information that's available to us. And of course, that has an effect. But if we could read on pieces of paper the same amount of information, it would have the same effects. I think the same is true for, screens and children. People are afraid that screens are going to do something horrible to children's brains. Well, obviously, to me, it's more of an educational question than a screen question. If you put your child in front of a screen in which they're passive and they're just looking and not doing much, well, it would be the same thing if you put them in front of a white wall and they're just staring at it and not doing much. It's an educational choice to put your child staring at a white wall. It's not the screen itself, I think, that is causing these effects.
Right. But I was thinking of some of the constructs that we were discussing earlier, like attention. There seems to be this folk idea that our attention spans are sort of declining as a function of screen. Maybe is this a place where we really need to define what attention is in the first place? Whether people are talking about visual attention or some other kind of attention? And if yes, is it really decreasing, increasing, or not having any effect?
Yeah, you're right that we need to define what attention means here. So I think that you're getting at the definition of attention, which is capacity to stay focused for a certain extent of time on a certain thing. And I think that is the case, that our focusing ability is changing. We pay attention to things for a lesser amount of time, and we're more able to switch.
Right.
Is this a bad thing? I don't know.
Sure.
And again, screens have made this possible because it's made us able to encounter lots of different information in a short period of time. But it's not the screen per se, again.
Right.
But surely there must be things about how the information is presented visually which could have an effect on our attention span or something.
Yes. I think this is probably a question that's very interesting to marketers. To go back to what we were talking about before, that they want to optimize the way that information is presented. And even, not speaking only about marketing, but also in educational practice, you want to be able to, determine what's the optimal way to organize information on a page to have a student read properly, a kid read properly through the different pieces of information? Do you need to alternate text and images? Is this going to help in coding? So there are all kinds of, more serious questions about the way that you present visual information that are going to influence the way we encode it, the way we pay attention, the way we remember. That's definitely true. And that's kind of a historic and vibrant research area. Visual ergonomics is a thing.
But I'm just thinking in the history of changes in our visual environment, would you say that, it would be fair to say that our visual attention dynamics sort of changed when books were invented?
Yes.
And would that then mean, just sort of spitballing here from what we talked about, that saccadic activity just remained concentrated on pages? And is that necessarily a good thing or a bad thing to be doing over prolonged periods of time?
Yeah, that's a great question. There have been some studies looking at how many saccades we make per day, what's the average size, and how does this relate to fatigue. So it is possible. I'm sure there are studies about this. I just don't know them very well. It's possible that these changes introduced by screens are changing the eye movements that we make. We're probably making smaller eye movements because we have small screens. It's changing probably the way that we focus in depth because we're often focusing on something that's at a very short distance. And these probably have effects on oculomotor fatigue. That's something that ophthalmologists could tell us. If they're observing in the population more eye pathologies that are related to fatigue and that might be related to these new ways of acquiring visual information.
And oculomotor fatigue is not the same as fatigue as we use it in common parlance, yeah?
It is the same. So it's like muscle fatigue. Like when you go jogging, afterwards your muscles are tired.
Okay.
Oculomotor fatigue is that your extraocular muscles, the ones that move your eyeballs around, are fatigued.
But there seems to be hierarchies of how you feel tired, don't they? Like there's low-level fatigue.
Yes.
And then you're like, oh, I feel tired after recording a podcast, let's say.
Yeah, so when you go jogging, you feel fatigued because you have muscle fatigue.
Right.
But I think sometimes in the evening we feel fatigued, and perhaps one of the contributors to that fatigue is
interesting.
Is extraocular muscles.
Interesting.
As you've been opening your eyes and looking around all day, and now you want to close them.
Right. But this is an unresolved question from all the studies that have been done so far.
I don't know that literature.
Okay.
That's really something for eye doctors and ophthalmologists. Yeah.
Gotcha. I think it's time that we start wrapping things up.
So we usually ask our guests if they have any recommendations for other pieces of media, not necessarily about psychology directly, but stuff that might reflect some of the themes of things we've discussed. So it could be anything. It could be a novel, or you can even recommend something that people can look into to learn more about what we discussed.
There are two things that I would answer to that question. The first is because I actually just finished reading Moby Dick. And I was very surprised in this novel. There's a whole section about whaling and what, whale physiology. It's rather sweet, actually. But in one of these long diatribes that Herman Melville has about whales, is a whole discussion about what whale vision must be, because they don't have forward-facing eyes. They have an eye on each side. And so he has this whole discussion about how this affects their psychology. Like they have two different images of the world, and how they are able to see boats and how they position themselves and how it must feel like almost as if they were inhabiting two different worlds. So I thought that was really interesting to find in Moby Dick some questions about vision science. This is a teeny tiny part of Moby Dick, so of course I recommend reading that novel to everyone, but not necessarily for the vision science part. But to really answer your question, I would say that what people can look at if they're interested in getting into vision science in a fun kind of a way is to look at visual illusions. There are a whole bunch of books, including books written by scientists, that use visual illusions as a probe to figure out the underlying mechanisms behind vision. The idea being that if you trick the visual system into seeing something that's not there or seeing something in a particular way, then this might give you insight about the normal functioning of the visual system. And so there are a lot of really great websites and really nice books where you have these visual illusions, and then a small explanation as what does this reveal about the visual system. And that can be a fun way to get into it.
If you have any websites to recommend, we can add a link in the podcast description.
Yeah, okay, I can send those to you.
That would be awesome. And I think one final thing that we also ask our guests is, if you feel that we haven't touched upon a topic that you thought was important to mention, or you would like to re-clarify some of the things that you said earlier, now's the time or space to do it, if you feel that's warranted.
I think I'm okay. I think we covered
Okay.
some things. I hope that I was clear enough to be of interest to your audience.
No, I think so. I think so.
Okay.
Or at least we can speak for the both of us right now. This has been Cognitations, a cognitive science podcast. We've been chatting with Thérèse Collins. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Thank you. Bye.
On the next episode of Cognitations, we'll chat with Daniel Nettle about the field of behavior ecology and its applications to contemporary societal problems such as poverty. If you're curious about how one can derive novel insights about such problems, be sure to tune in.